Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. Today's video, I'm going to be going over everything that I know about Navia in this ultimate guide for Navia. I've got to keep things pretty concise as usual for these ultimate guides because otherwise they would just be way too long because there's always a ton of information when it comes to these new Hoyoverse characters. So as usual for one of these guide videos, I'm going to be going over her entire kit. I'll be going over her artifacts, stat choices, energy recharge, then her weapons. After that, we'll talk about some techs and combos. And after that, we will talk about constellations and pull priority. And finally, last but not least, we're going to talk about her teams. Starting off with her basic attacks. So her basic attacks do physical damage by default, but thanks to her passive one right here, we are able to infuse her with geo damage for 4 seconds after using her elemental skill. Now, very importantly, this infusion will also provide her 40% additional bonus damage to her normal attacks, charge attacks, and plunge attacks. When it comes to what attack strings you should actually use, we're going to need to know a little bit more about her kit in order to actually talk about her optimal combos and stuff. So we will talk about the combos and stuff in the text and combos section of the video. So we're going to move on to her elemental skill. You can have up to 2 stacks for it. It generates 3 to 4 particles. It has a 9-second cooldown. It deals some Usha damage once every 7 seconds. And it is, of course, an attack scaling ability, and it has a very high 710.6% base multiplier. So basically with Navia, you can pick up crystallizes, which give her a crystal shrapnel for each crystallized that she picks up. You can pick up to 6 crystallized shards. It's important to note that while you have 0 to 3 stacks of crystal shrapnel, these will increase her multiplier. When you have 0, 1, 2, or 3 crystal shrapnel consumed, then she will fire out 5, 7, 9, and 11 Rosula shard shots. Now we can see in this freeze frame that I showcased in her Constellation 0 showcase video that you can see the individual shard shots actually fire out from her elemental skill. Now these shard shots pierce and they fire out in a cone shape, very similar to how a shotgun works in most video games. The amount of damage that she does depends on how many Rosula shard shots actually pass through the enemy. And I have this chart here which demonstrates how the multiplier is increased based on how many shard shots actually pass through the enemy. And by the time you consume 3 or more shrapnel, you will do the full 2x multiplier, which is 1421.2% multiplier. So you're heavily incentivized to go up to 3 shrapnel before utilizing her elemental skill. However, because you can stack this up to 6 times, after the first 3 shrapnel that are consumed, shrapnels 4, 5, and 6 will add 15 bonus damage for each of them, up to a total of a maximum of 45% bonus damage if you consume all 6 shrapnel. Now, the hold version is great because it will actually vacuum up nearby shrapnel, and it will also allow you to aim it a bit better, especially against multiple enemies that might be a bit spread out. So up next is her ultimate. Fortunately, her ultimate is much more simple than her very convoluted elemental skill. Her ultimate generates 1 shrapnel every 2.4 seconds for a total of up to 5 entire shrapnels generated just from this part of her elemental burst. Now, of course, her ultimate also deals geo damage itself. It deals 1 instance of the skill damage and 17 additional ticks for a total of 1456% total multiplier. Now that multiplier is huge, but it is spread out over an entire 12 seconds, so it feels and honestly is much less impactful than, for example, her elemental skill. However, what it does do is that it has standard ICD on the cannon fire support as well as independent ICD on the skill damage. So that means that this will also generate a ton of crystallizes for you throughout its duration. It's also important to note that it actually follows Navia, so you're not limited to circle impact. It does not snapshot those, so unfortunately you can't snapshot it with something like Bennett's Burst for it to actually do a ton of damage. And finally, it does work against invincible targets, and what I mean by it working, I mean it does generate your crystal shrapnel even when hitting an invincible enemy, like for example the Kagumenki as it's getting up from its slumber. And finally, we can quickly mention that having Petch teammates, which is Pyro, Electro, Cryo, or Hydro teammates, will provide 20% attack for each of them, stacking up to 2 times. So this incentivizes Navia to have up to 2 Pyro, Electro, Cryo, Hydro characters on her team to maximize this attack buff, going up to a massive 40% attack buff. Now, as for talent priority, I highly recommend leveling up her skill first. Then, in my opinion, her basic attack and ultimate can be leveled up subsequently afterwards. Now, one thing about Crystallize that most people don't realize is that you can only have 3 Crystallizes on field at any one given moment. And that means that you do need to proactively try to grab some Crystallizes or use her Hold Elemental skill to suck up some Crystallizes before you have more than 3 Crystallizes being generated on the field. So next, let's talk about her combos. And I was actually surprised in the results for her combos. Now, we have, of course, just the basic EN4 combo, and the N4 itself, which this chart is talking about the Crystallizes generated by the combo itself. It does not include the Crystallizes generated by her elemental skill. So do keep that in mind. The basic N4 combo weirdly only generates 1 Crystallize. So there's something about the ICDs that's a bit wonky here, where it's not generating another Crystallize. However, the N3-N2 will actually generate 2 Crystallizes, while at the same time doing a bit more damage on the actual basic attack multipliers. And finally, N4-N1, it still only generates 1 Crystallize. So I personally prefer now doing N3-N2 to generate an additional Crystallize in order to obviously pick up as Crystal Shrapnel to enhance her next elemental skill. And up next, we actually have a pragmatic purpose for her charge attack. Her charge attack actually generates 3 Crystallizes. So this actually generates the most amount of Crystallizes, which I find very interesting. But do keep in mind that it does consume a lot of stamina, and you do want to dash cancel out of the 7th hit from her charge attack because, you know, you don't want her to do additional physical damage. But do keep in mind that because her elemental skill generates a Crystallize and her charge attack generates 3 Crystallizes, this means that you do need to pick up at least 1 Crystallize. Now, her charge attack is a bit inconsistent because if you do get hit, you'll suffer hit stun, even if Navia isn't interrupted. And because of that hit stun, your 7th charge attack spin might not actually be infused with Geo. So it is a bit situational, but do keep in mind that sometimes you can generate 1 additional Crystallized Shard with her charge attack. And finally, we have the Dragon Strike combo, which is a lot of fun. This is the highest theoretical basic attack multiplier that you can output, but it still also only generates 2 Crystallizes. And finally, you do really need the movement speed bonus, like for example, Diona's elemental skill. And from what I'm seeing, although it is a lot of fun to do and it's slightly higher multipliers, increasing her basic attack damage multiplier isn't that important for her damage output. And having to slot in a character like Diona just for the movement speed bonus isn't worth it, but it is a lot of fun, and perhaps there is more practical uses to it than I'm seeing right now. Up next, let's talk about her artifact options, starting with obviously her overall best in slot option, which is the Nighttime Whispers in the Echoing Wood. Now, do keep in mind that you will also be farming the Song of Days Past, which is not really a great artifact set, so it's slightly less resin efficient. However, it is overall still the most recommended artifact set because you also gain the bonus for 1 second after the shield is lost, and Crystallizers are notoriously flimsy, but because you'll often use her Hold Elemental skill and then unleash it right after you pick up the Crystallizes, this buff will generally be pretty reliable when it comes to Navia utilizing it. Now, the next artifact set is the Marichosi Hunter. Now, in particular, I highly recommend utilizing this set with Furina. So it does kind of lock her in with Furina in order to reliably get this buff. However, it does come pretty close to the overall damage output that the 4-piece Nighttime Whispers in the Echoing Woods provides. However, without Furina, then it is not a recommended artifact set, dealing even less than having no set bonus, because you're going to have your crit ratios really wonky, right? You're going to have something like 64% crit rate with 200% crit damage, which is why it actually does less damage than the no set bonus. Up next, we have the 4-piece Golden Troop, which is decent as well. However, it does have some issues because generally speaking, Navia does like to be on field to use her normal attacks. However, if you primarily use her as a quick swap character, then this is definitely a reasonable option. And up next, we have two-piece combinations like, for example, the two-piece Gladiators plus two-piece Archaic Petra. And of course, these are always usable as you're farming for a better four-piece set option. Now for her stats, you'll want an attack percent timepiece, a geo damage goblet for most situations, and a crit rate circlet. Now of course you can use an attack percent goblet, especially with a support like Furina. And for the substats, it's just the same: crit rate and crit damage, focus on the 1-to-2 crit ratio. Then we have attack percent. And finally, for energy recharge, I find myself with 130% energy recharge to be very comfortable, especially since you often pair Navia with a second geo character. Next, we're going to talk about her weapons, and now as the game is getting older, these charts are getting ridiculously large. So starting off, obviously her best in slot option is going to be the Verdict, her signature weapon. However, it is absolutely worth mentioning that the Unforged, the Wolf's Gravestone, and the Beacon of the Reed Sea are all great options on her, roughly performing at about 90-ish% of her signature weapon, and are situationally better than each other. Really, it just kind of depends on the situation. That's what situationally means. Now the next tier of weapons will be the Serpent Spine, especially with refinements, as well as, surprisingly, the Red Hornstone Thresher is not a terrible option because it does enhance her normal and charge attacks by a reasonable amount, and it has a ton of crit damage, which you love to see. But the Serpent Spine, unfortunately, crystallizes generally not enough to keep this weapon's passive reliably. I do recommend pairing her with Zhongli as usual with the Serpent Spine, but Zhongli is of course one of her best teammates, so it is a great option to run with her. Now after that, I would say the Talking Stick, which I don't even think I have on my account. I do have it. Okay, so afterwards we have the Talking Stick, and I do recommend pairing her up with Bennett in order to at least have half of the weapons buff. And after that, you're going to need some weird ways to really activate this. So it is kind of situational, and while it's still pretty solid, I personally do rank it behind the other weapons. Now, a couple other off-kilter options are the Song of Broken Wallets as well as the Skyward Pride. Both of these are actually usable on her, although I would rank them very similarly to the Talking Stick. And now we're talking about some great free-to-play options, which include the Tidal Shadow as well as the Ultimate Overlord's Mega Magic Sword, which is the upcoming event weapon. And that weapon will have plenty of energy recharge for you while also providing a decent amount of attack percent and having high base attack, which is great for Navia. So when it comes to the Tidal Shadow versus the Ultimate Overlord's Mega Magic Sword, it kind of goes to preference in my opinion, with the Tidal Shadow also being slightly more restrictive in terms of team building because you'll want a reliable healer to activate this, because Bennett is not actually reliable because you do have to be hit under 70% HP for his healing to activate. But you know, there are plenty of team archetypes for Navia where a reliable healer is useful. Now, another weapon is the Black Cliff Slasher, which if you are able to get 3+ kills, it is a pretty competitive option to even the 5-star options. That's always been the case with the Black Cliff Slasher. However, as usual, I just, it's hard to recommend the Black Cliff Slasher because that would entail spending your valuable star glitter on this weapon and potential refinements. But yeah, it is a good option if you already have it and if you already have some refinements on it. And finally, we have the Sacrificial Greatsword. So this is the only weapon that I'm not really willing to comment on how great or good I think it will be. Now, one nice thing about it is that it does fulfill your energy requirements basically immediately. It is recommended to have a good amount of refinements on it, and you can absolutely use it, especially if you just want to use her Shotgun Blast more often. But do keep in mind that you will need to generate more crystallizes for it to really be worth using the Sacrificial Greatsword. And right now, the crystallize economy, I'm not that familiar with, so I'm going to put a question mark next to it. We're going to need more testing involved when it comes to the Sacrificial Greatsword. So up next, let's talk about pull priority as well as her constellations. Her Constellation 1 pretty much just solves her energy issues as well as I believe decreases the cooldown a bit so you can have even better uptime on it. And her Constellation 2 though is the main one that you'd be targeting if you'd be getting her Constellation 1. This provides up to 36% crit rate on her elemental skill, which will allow you to stack a ton of crit damage and therefore do a lot more damage with Navia's elemental skill. So I don't know if the extra cannon fire support shot generates a shrapnel if Navia's ultimate is already active because of the 2.4 second cooldown on her ultimate to generate a shrapnel. If this generates a shrapnel on top of it, then it will be very good. So do let us know down in the comments below whether or not this will generate an extra shrapnel even if her ultimate is already active. Her Constellation 3 just makes her elemental skill do more damage. You love to see it. Her Constellation 4 will just make all geo damage do more damage on her team, including her teammates, which is nice. And her Constellation 5 is pretty much not very useful. And her Constellation 6 is the big one, doing up to 135% more crit damage, which is insane. And finally, even more insane, it will refund any shrapnel consumed over 3. So if you do a full 6 shot, you will still have 3 shrapnel left over. And by Constellation 6, Refinement 5, she should be doing roughly 2.6 times the amount of damage on her elemental skill. For her pull priority, honestly, if you have the Wolf's Gravestone, the Unforged, the Beacon of the Reed Sea, or a highly refined Serpent Spine, you'll only see a small 10% increase in her overall damage output with her signature weapon. However, admittingly, the drip of her signature weapon is well worth it in my personal opinion. Now, if you're using something like the Tidal Shadow or the Event weapon, then upgrading to her signature weapon is definitely a very big power boost. Now, if you do have a good claymore and want to go over Constellations, honestly, I would go for Constellation 2. And if you're just going to stop at Constellation 1, I would either just skip it or forget it. And if you only really have enough for Constellation 1, then personally, I would just keep her at Constellation 0, because while her Constellation 1 is okay, it's not really that great. The main benefit you'll get is by going up to Constellation 2. Next, let's talk about Navia's team building. And this is where Navia is actually very flexible and a very powerful character. Now, perhaps the most important teammate for Navia is actually going to be an off-field Petch element applier. And there's a lot of Petch characters that fulfill this potential role. So I'm going to kind of rattle through them for you guys just to, mention them. We have Xiangling, Toma, Dea, Xingqiu, Yelan, Furina, Kokomi, and I'm a bit iffy on this one, but Candace as well. We have Yaimiko, Fischl, Beidou, Dory, and if you can solve her energy issues, we have Lisa. We have one of my personal favorites, Kuki. We have Charlotte up next, Rosaria, Diona if you can maintain her burst uptime, Layla who has a very reliable shield, and our good old friend who will never betray us, Kaya. I'm sure I've missed some characters, but as you can see, there is a very large roster to choose from, with each of these different off-field Petch applicator characters having their own unique advantages, which obviously I can't cover what every single one can provide for Navia. You will have to use your knowledge of which of those characters to actually throw on a team with Navia. The second Petch character that can be slotted in can be one of those aforementioned characters, or even a more utility focused character, like for example Bennett. Bennett is the most standout out of all these, especially if you have Navia's signature weapon, because Bennett will provide a colossal damage boost. But besides Bennett, you can always run some other characters here. You can run a second off-field Petch applicator. You can run, a healer perhaps. There's just so many options instead of Bennett. And that goes into the fourth slot, which in my opinion, especially for lower Constellation Navias, a second Geo character is going to be an invaluable addition, with Zhongli being my personal favorite second Geo character, followed by, of course, Albedo, who will do much more damage than Zhongli. But Zhongli, of course, has the resistance shred, as well as, other benefits that he provides, as well as the world's thickest shield. That's not to say that you cannot run the Geo Traveler, who will provide 10% crit rate, as well as a lot of Geo Particles for Navia. There's no reason why you can't run Ningguang. Ningguang, of course, will do a reasonable amount of damage herself, especially when paired with Bennett. Of course, you can run any of the other Geo characters, but personally, I think the other ones stand out a bit more. Now, Noelle is an interesting case where you can utilize her on field as well as to heal, but I actually think that Navia and Noelle's role actually overlap a lot, because Navia's basic attack damage might be competitive to Noelle's. So it's hard to say if it is decent to slot Navia with Noelle, but of course you can always run Navia as a sub DPS for Noelle. Now, I did want to quickly talk about a very important mentality to have when building a double Geo, double Petch team with Navia. When it comes to the two Petch characters, their damage is not nearly as important. And that's because we're going to be missing out on key vaporizes, we're going to be missing out on Viridescent Veneer swirls, and we're going to be missing out on Aggravate. So because we're missing out on those key reactions that actually enhance Petch character damage significantly, you don't need to focus or worry too much about how much damage your Petch characters are doing. So even a character like Xiangling, her damage is going to be non-negligible in this team, but it's going to be much more important to have high pyro application uptime to generate crystallizes so Navia can actually maximize her damage. So having a Favonius build Xiangling, in my opinion, is going to be more valuable on this team than having Xiangling do a little bit more damage with, for example, the catch. Navia does so much damage, it's absolutely worth having these characters have much better uptime over focusing on their personal damage. Which brings us into the next team archetype, and that's going to be a Petch damage team with Navia as more of a sub DPS role. So we have a Mono Pyro example here where Kazuha will actually amplify Mono Pyro Xiangling's damage by a significant amount, where you can mainly rely on Navia's elemental burst to generate crystallized shards as well as shrapnel for her, and swap her on, do a couple nukes, and focus on battering Xiangling because her damage will make up a much higher portion of this team's damage thanks to a character like Kazuha. Another solid option is a higher DPS team like this one, especially with Constellation 1 Neuvillette when paired with Furina. And we're going to need a healer here, so let's actually swap in Jean here. But yes, this team will actually do quite well, with Navia only requiring a very small amount of field time to unload her elemental skills, which can be weaved in between Neuvillette's giant lasers, as well as Navia's elemental burst. Navia can be played as a quick swap character on a team like this, where she can also provide a stack of Draconic Glories to our boy Neuvillette, who is just going to absolutely murder everything with a team like this. Okay, so that covers pretty much everything that I wanted to teach you guys about Navia. Let me know what I missed down below, and if there are any additional techs, teams that you guys find really effective with her, as well as any other details that I might have missed. Throw it down in the comments below because it is very helpful to other viewers of this video, and be sure to go check the comments to see if there's any additional useful information for you down there. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Went to Lose, signing out.